After the dimensional storms decades ago, multiple dimensional zones appeared across the world: gods, immortals, ghosts, monsters, angels, devils, elves, etc. All kinds of legendary dimensional creatures were discovered. Via hunting these dimensional creatures, humans acquire their powers. As the grizzled Yukube lectured, he would occasionally cast his gaze to the corner seat at the back of the classroom. The other students were listening attentively, but the boy in the corner had his textbook in front of him while sleeping with his arm lay outstretched on the table. From time to time, one could hear faint snoring. Yukube shook his head indiscernibly as he sighed inwardly. So what if you are talented? What can you accomplish if you falter from a single setback? Although the setback from that failure was big, not recovering from it really doesn't make him live up to the former principal's approbation of him. Yukube recalled what the former principal had said to him before his retirement. Looking back at the boy sleeping soundly on the table with drool hanging from the corner of his lips, he couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. Cube, I've seen many geniuses in my life. In summary, there are two types of geniuses. The former principal back then had very bright eyes. What are the two types? Yukube had asked curiously. One type of genius is called Zhou Wen, the other type is the other geniuses. The former principal's words left a deep impression on Yukube, but the student who was given heaps of praises by the former principal was now a degenerate, one who had no intention of improving himself. All he did was sleep in class. After class, he would be gaming on his cell phone. Yukube had attempted to bolster Zhou Wen's confidence in the past, hoping that he could rally him up. But despite the numerous pep talks, Zhou Wen remained the same. He continued sleeping in class and gaming out of class. He didn't focus on cultivation as though he had lost all sense of enterprise. Ring. With the bell ringing to mark the end of class, Yukube saw Zhou Wen sit straight up, having awoken from his sweet slumber. Without even turning back, he grabbed his phone and rushed out of the classroom. This only disappointed Yukube as he muttered with a sigh, "Principal, I've tried my best." Unfortunately, Zhou Wen is a hopeless case. Zhou Wen jogged the entire way and soon left the building before coming to a secluded corner in the school compound. He wasn't oblivious to the strange looks his teachers and schoolmates gave him, but he didn't take it to heart. Others believed that Zhou Wen had wallowed in self-misery because he had failed to handle the setback, but he knew very well that he had never taken the defeat to heart. The reason he was abandoning himself to vice was due to an incomprehensible reason that even he couldn't explain. After unlocking his phone with great familiarity, Zhou Wen launched a game program called Ant Nest. Soon, the phone's screen revealed the dark interior of an ant nest. The meandering paths had countless black ants crawling about. After ensuring that no one was looking at him, Zhou Wen pricked his finger and dripped a drop of blood onto the screen. A strange scene happened the next second. The drop of blood seeped into the screen as a blood-colored avatar appeared in the game screen of Ant Nest. Beside the blood-colored avatar was a stat window. Zhou Wen. Age 16 years. Lifeform level mortal. Strength 9. Speed 5. Constitution 8. Primordial energy 4. Primordial energy art, ascetic meditation. Primordial energy skills none. Primordial energy pet none. Ever since the dimensional storms, all sorts of dimensional life forms had appeared. They were roughly categorized as mortal, legendary, epic, and mythical. Humans stood at the bottom of the totem pole as mortals. By cultivating in primordial energy arts, they could raise their constitutions and evolve to higher life forms. However, simply cultivating in a primordial energy art to hone one's body and evolve was extremely slow. Hunting dimensional creatures and robbing them of their dimensional crystals for one's own use allowed accelerated evolution. Pan-dimensional creatures lurked in dangerous places. Other than the zones where humanity had explored, the other zones were almost a sure ticket to death. Not everyone was willing to risk their lives. Furthermore, Earth's Federation had clear rules: underage youths were forbidden entry into the dimensional zones. The ascetic meditation, which Zhou Wen had cultivated, was also a primordial energy art. It solely relied on arduously tempering one's body to cultivate primordial energy without the reliance on external forces. In the Federation, there were plenty of 16-year-old geniuses who could produce primordial energy from cultivation, but few people on Earth could do it simply by cultivating ascetic meditation and tempering his body to produce primordial energy, especially without any external help. He was the only one capable of doing so in the history of the small town of Guide City. Shortly after, every teacher and student in Guide High School believed that Zhou Wen would achieve great things in the future. Then, one day a transfer student came to Guide High School and challenged him. To everyone's surprise, the transfer student defeated him in one strike. Furthermore, it was done by a girl. Zhou Wen stopped cultivating arduously after that. He appeared to abandon himself to vice. People imagined that he was mentally weak and couldn't suffer the setback, but Zhou Wen knew very well that his change had nothing to do with the failure. It was completely because of the mysterious phone in his hand. Zhou Wen looked down at his phone as he kept controlling the blood-colored avatar on it to slay the black ants in an ant nest. Killed mortal creature, vigor ant. Killed mortal creature, vigor ant. Killed mortal creature, vigor ant. Notifications quickly flashed past as he killed every ant. Ding. After killing countless vigor ants, he suddenly heard a crisp sound as a special notice appeared on the screen: killed mortal creature, vigor ant. Discovered primordial energy crystal. Zhou Wen focused his gaze and saw a crystalline body resembling a diamond that appeared after a vigor ant was killed. On it was the number 5. He was delighted as he hurriedly controlled the blood-colored avatar to pick up the primordial energy crystal. The moment the primordial energy crystal touched its fingers, it immediately transformed into a strange aura that drilled into the blood-colored avatar's body. Simultaneously, Joe felt strength surge into his body from his phone as though he had been struck by lightning. It caused the primordial energy within him to be rapidly replenished. The primordial energy entry in the blood-colored avatar's stats went from 4 to 5. After killing a dimensional creature, there was a chance that various kinds of crystals would drop. The most common crystals were strength, speed, constitution, and primordial energy crystals. The usage of strength crystals enhanced the strength of humans, while using speed crystals increased one's speed. The other crystals had similar effects. But in reality, crystals didn't have numeric displays. Humans couldn't see their own stats and only knew that their strength increased after using a strength crystal without knowing the exact quantitative increase. The mysterious phone in Zhou Wen's hand not only allowed him to obtain dimensional crystals that others had to risk their lives in dimensional zones to obtain, but it also allowed him to see the numeric values of the dimensional creatures, himself, as well as the dimensional crystals. Article 2 of 30. Ever since he had obtained that phone, Zhou Wen had spent nearly every moment grinding on it with a game. In turn, he received all kinds of dimensional crystals. In the past, his strength was 7, speed was 4, constitution was 7, and primordial energy was 1. After receiving the dimensional crystals from grinding, he had raised all these values in slightly more than a month. If it were in the past, it might have taken him years to even develop so quickly. After using large numbers of dimensional crystals, Zhou Wen realized a set of rules. No matter which dimensional crystal it was, as long as its value was higher than his, using it would result in his stats directly rising to the same value as the said dimensional crystal. But if the dimensional crystal's value was lower or the same as his, it could only replenish some of his energy. Then, by cultivating the primordial energy art, he could raise his own stats instead of a direct raise. This also meant that the higher the dimensional crystal's value was, the better. Its effects on Zhou Wen would also be amplified. However, having killed so many vigor ants in the ant nest, the highest strength crystal he had seen was a 9. The highest constitution crystal was only an 8. Speed crystals were all low in value. Primordial energy crystals were extremely rare. The 5 he had received today were the highest valued he had seen to date. Zhou Wen had considered the possibility that it had something to do with the vigor ants' natural makeup. They were outstanding when it came to their strength and constitution, but their speed was lacking. This was also why the strength crystals that he received were relatively high in value, while speed crystals weren't much to speak of. However, even low-valued dimensional crystals could be used as energy supplements, allowing Zhou Wen to quickly cultivate ascetic meditation, thus it wasn't completely useless. The only regret was that the crystals that dropped in the game were directly absorbed upon contact with the blood-colored avatar. They couldn't be brought to the real world, otherwise, just the sale of the low-valued crystals he had no use for would be enough to make him quite a wealthy person. There were many ants in the ant nest, and whenever they discovered Zhou Wen's blood-colored avatar, the number that gathered only increased. After killing over 100 vigor ants, another dimensional crystal dropped. Unfortunately, it was a strength crystal 3 and could only be used for energy replenishment. The drop rate of dimensional crystals wasn't high, and most of them were valued at 3 or lower. The higher valued ones had extremely low drop rates, so Zhou Wen could only rely on massive amounts of grinding to raise the chances of him getting them. This was also the reason he often slept in class and stopped cultivating. Apart from classes, he spent the rest of his time grinding, even at night. He didn't have the time or energy to cultivate or pay attention in class. Even so, the rate at which he strengthened himself was incomparable to the past. If he had only cultivated ascetic meditation like before, the time it took to raise his primordial energy to 5 would have been several times or even dozens of times longer. As the number of vigor ants increased, Zhou Wen was beginning to feel overwhelmed. Before long, the blood-colored avatar was inundated by vigor ants and the screen went black. Zhou Wen had no choice but to restart the game by dripping a drop of blood onto the game's screen. His blood was akin to a 1-up in games, 1 drop of blood was a life. With the game launched, he embarked on his grinding again, killing 1 vigor ant after another. However, Zhou Wen wasn't too lucky this time. Not a single dimensional crystal dropped despite killing over 100 vigor ants. Since Zhou Wen was a sedate person and not quick-tempered, he continued to patiently grind in the ant nest. Suddenly, he saw a somewhat special vigor ant amidst the hordes. This vigor ant was blood red in color, as though it was completely covered in blood. It stood out among the other black vigor ants, and its head was slightly bigger. Zhou Wen noticed it immediately. Upon noticing the red vigor ant gearing for a charge, Zhou Wen cautiously probed it and found its strength and speed was far greater than other black vigor ants. However, it was still manageable for him. After positioning the blood-colored avatar several times, it managed to hit the red vigor ant, but only dealt minor damage to it. He had failed to slay it. However, there was still clear progress. The red vigor ant's health bar was slowly dropping. Perhaps about 100 strikes were needed to slay it. Thankfully, the red vigor ant was only slightly faster than the typical black vigor ant. The blood-colored avatar had enough time to position itself and dodge, so killing it was only a matter of time. However, the black vigor ants were increasing in number. The development worried Zhou Wen because, at this speed, he might be swarmed by the ant horde before he successfully killed the red vigor ant. However, no idea came to mind for the time being. Zhou Wen could only do his best to control the blood-colored avatar's speed to deal damage to the red vigor ant. Just as the red vigor ant's health bar almost depleted to zero, the surrounding vigor ants increased, giving the blood-colored avatar no space to circle around the former. Crack. The blood-colored avatar failed to dodge in time and was bitten by a black vigor ant. Instantly, its health bar was almost halved. Zhou Wen knew that he was at the end of the rope. All he could do was to use the blood-colored avatar to deliver one final strike with all its might at the red vigor ant. Boom. When the punch landed, the red vigor ant's vital spot was struck. Its final bit of health was depleted and its red carapace instantly exploded. 2 crystals burst out from its carcass. Zhou Wen didn't have the luxury to see what type of dimensional crystals they were. His blood-colored avatar was in a critical state as the 2 crystals were picked up. Moments after the blood-colored avatar picked up the 2-dimensional crystals, it was swarmed by the vigor ant horde, and before long, the screen went black. Zhou Wen looked at the 2 notifications that appeared on the screen. He heaved a deep sigh of relief, for he had had similar experiences. As long as he could pick up a dimensional crystal before dying, the effects would be applied. Killed mortal creature vigor ant. Discovered primordial energy crystal. Killed mortal creature vigor ant. Discovered vigor ant crystal. Upon seeing the 2 notifications on the screen, Zhou Wen couldn't help but be taken aback. He had seen a primordial energy crystal drop plenty of times, but a dimensional crystal named after vigor ants was a first. After a brief pause, Zhou Wen reacted. Although he had never seen such dimensional crystals, he had heard of their existence. In textbooks and videos on the internet, people had used similar crystals. However, they weren't vigor ant crystals but crystals of other dimensional creatures. Could it be that this is one of those legendary dimensional crystals? While Zhou Wen was feeling exhilarated, he felt a strange force from his phone spread through his body. Article 3 of 30. A force surged through Zhou Wen's body like a bolt of lightning. He was no stranger to such a feeling, for it was the feeling he received when absorbing primordial energy crystals. However, this absorption was far more intense than anything he had previously felt. It was many times more intense than his past absorption of the 5-valued primordial energy crystal. What's the value of this primordial energy crystal? Why is it so intense? As Zhou Wen reeled into light, he felt another force surge into his body. Unlike the primordial energy crystal, this force surged through his body like an electric snake, opening up his originally sealed meridians, opening up a strange new path. It's true. The Vigor Ant crystal is a primordial energy skill crystal as spoken in legends. However, I wonder what this Vigor Ant's primordial energy skill is. Zhou Wen was filled with anticipation. As the electric snake-like force flowed through his body, Zhou Wen's primordial energy was being stirred as it began circulating in the newly opened pathways. Zhou Wen was surprised to discover that with the circulation of the primordial energy, his hands turned blood red with a metallic sheen. Furthermore, he had a strange swollen feeling. Although his palms didn't increase in size, it made him feel that his hands contained an immense strength, one that was eager to blast out his palms. Now, Zhou Wen had the urge to deal a punch, but he ultimately held back. He was on campus, and it wasn't in his best interest to cause a commotion. Furthermore, any damage to public property required him to pay compensation. Nearly 20 minutes later, the swelling feeling gradually subsided. His hands recovered to normal as the primordial energy in him stopped circulating. However, Zhou Wen knew that this primordial energy blast skill had been imprinted deep in his body and soul. It had seemingly become innate to his body, something he could not forget no matter how he tried. Zhou Wen couldn't wait to look at his phone. The game interface had already gone black. He immediately restarted the game and dripped a drop of blood in. When his in-game avatar appeared, he immediately checked his character stats. Zhou Wen. Age 16 years. Lifeform level mortal. Strength 9. Speed 5. Constitution 8. Primordial energy 9. Primordial energy art ascetic meditation. Primordial energy skill Vigor Divine Fist rank 7. Companion beast none. Zhou Wen was overjoyed. His primordial energy had risen all the way to 9. It meant that the primordial energy crystal he had absorbed was valued at 9. And the rank 7 indicated behind Vigor Divine Fist was similar to 7 valued stat crystals. Without any cultivation, Zhou Wen's Vigor Divine Fist had reached a rather high rank. As primordial energy skills were relatively rare, they were rather expensive. However, after receiving this skill, he would make use of it. He could greatly enhance his various abilities, unleashing combat strength that far exceeded his normal standards. It gave him the important means to protect himself and kill enemies. No one would dislike having too many primordial energy skills. In the past, Zhou Wen had lacked the finances to purchase primordial energy skill crystals, and with him fully focused on cultivating ascetic meditation, he lacked the time and energy to practice the skills. This Vigor Divine Fist was his first primordial energy skill, and from its name and effects, it was likely a skill that enhanced the strength of both his fists. Indeed, the ant nest in the game is identical to the dimensional zones in the real world. Does this mean that the game will also drop companion beasts? Zhou Wen felt slightly pumped. As he began grinding again in the game, his avatar was similarly able to use Vigor Divine Fist. Eagerly, Zhou Wen made his avatar use Vigor Divine Fist to see its might. Boom. The blood-colored avatar struck a vigor ant, bashing its head into its body. Then, its body exploded due to the immense pressure. Its flesh, blood, and carapace splattered everywhere, reducing it to a blob. Zhou Wen was alarmed and delighted upon seeing this. The blood-colored avatar was equivalent to a clone. If it could produce such might, it also meant that he could do the same in reality. In the past, he had needed several strikes to kill a vigor ant, and that had needed him to strike a vital spot. Vigor Divine Fist could ignore the vigor ant's carapace's defense and directly blast them apart. Its strength was frighteningly potent. However, although Vigor Divine Fist was powerful, this punch expended 4 primordial energy. With Zhou Wen's maximum primordial energy at 9, he could only deliver 2 strikes before he was drained. Although primordial energy could recover on its own, it happened rather slowly. Zhou Wen took an hour to recover 1 point, so it was sorely insufficient to keep up with his expenditure. Of course, he could also use primordial energy crystals to quickly recover primordial energy. To most people, this was an extremely extravagant act. Although he had received a primordial energy skill, he could only use it as a trump card for now. Zhou Wen continued patiently grinding as before, hoping that a more magical drop would appear. Grinding was undoubtedly dull and boring. However, for a person who could hone his body and cultivate primordial energy through ascetic meditation before the age of 16, this boredom was nothing. While Zhou Wen was holding his phone and engrossed with grinding, he suddenly sensed someone approaching him. Looking up, he saw a tall girl in a high school uniform walk over. Zhou Wen turned to look around her. Students typically didn't come here, and it was the same at present. He was apparently the only person around for dozens of meters, and it was for this reason that he chose this spot to game. Don't tell me Fang Ruoxi is looking for me. Zhou Wen looked at the girl walking straight towards him, and in response, he could only put away his phone for he didn't wish for anyone to see what was on it. Otherwise, it could invite huge trouble for him. Fang Ruoxi was tall, standing at a height of 1.75 meters. At this age, she wasn't short among men and would stand out among women. Although she was tall, her body proportions were excellent. Together with her slender body and constant training, she didn't seem too big in size. Her long, slender legs and exaggerated curves gave quite a strong visual impact. She had a primal charm of a feral nature. Fang Ruoxi's name was quite a demure name for a girl, but it didn't match her character. She was a rather proud girl. Before Njing transferred over, Fang Ruoxi and Zhou Wen were considered the 2 most illustrious geniuses in Guide High School. However, the 2 of them weren't in the same class. They both had asocial characters, and as Zhou Wen spent most of his time focusing on cultivating ascetic meditation and honing his body, the 2 never had much interaction other than the polite greeting from time to time. Fang Ruoxi was clearly here for Zhou Wen. It left him perplexed, unsure why she was looking for him. Zhou Wen, I wish to invite you to join my team for the combat test at the end of the graduation exams. Fang Ruoxi came before Zhou Wen and said those startling words to him. Article 4 of 30. The cultivation of primordial energy art already played an important role in the Earth Federation's physical education system. Apart from the ordinary subjects tested at the college entrance examinations, there was a special combat test. As combat tests were dangerous, not every candidate needed to participate, and the results weren't included in the overall score of the entrance examinations. It was completely voluntary to participate, but to apply for some special schools, the results of a combat test was necessary for standardization purposes. In the past 10 years, more and more famous schools used the results of the combat test as one of the standards for student recruitment. Of course, to get a job involving dimensional zones, the results on the combat test was a very good prerequisite. Although Zhou Wen could obtain dimensional crystals from the phone without him risking his life to enter dimensional zones, he still planned on taking the combat test and enter a school focused on cultivation. This would aid him in getting a job related to the dimensional zones in the future. If Zhou Wen didn't involve himself in any dimensional zone work, he wouldn't have the sources or channels to obtain dimensional crystals. This would make it difficult for him to explain his rapid growth or any companion beasts he might receive in the future. By hiding in plain sight, he would not garner the notice of others, just as a diamond would be lost in a sea of crystals. Zhou Wen didn't wish to risk his life at the dimensional zones, but he needed to have a job involving such matters. At the very least, he needed a channel to obtain dimensional items. This way, he wouldn't be suspected when he used large numbers of dimensional crystals in the future. The combat test wasn't a solo affair. Instead, it was carried out in a team of 4. Apart from one's individual combat prowess, teamwork, leadership, and other traits influenced the final results. If one were to be the final man standing in the combat test, with the other teammates dropping out ahead of time or an accident happening, one's score would be greatly affected, even if the individual did very well to receive high individual scores. Zhou Wen had quite a good reputation in Guide High School in the past. He was an ideal teammate, but in the past month or so, his image and reputation had drastically declined. There were also significant doubts about his abilities. It was still understandable if an ordinary student were to team up with him, but for Fang Ruoxi, who had a chance of coming first in the Guide City combat test, there wasn't a good reason for her to recruit him. Zhou Wen had been famous because of his cultivation of ascetic meditation. But when it came to actual strength, there were a few 16-year-olds in Guide High School who had cultivated primordial energy. However, they were not like Zhou Wen, who simply relied on honing his body to cultivate primordial energy. They had more or less absorbed primordial energy crystals to supplement their cultivation. Why are you recruiting me? Zhou Wen asked Fang Ruoxi with piqued interest. Fang Ruoxi and Zhou Wen locked gazes. Her eyes were clear and untainted like a mountain spring. I want to do my best to get a high score on the combat test, so I need a strong teammate. And you have that strength, Fang Ruoxi said calmly. You are referring to me from a month ago, right? Fang Ruoxi's glimmering eyes stared at Zhou Wen intently as she said firmly, from what I see, Zhou Wen is Zhou Wen. He has never changed. You are still the only person in Guide High School that I view as my match. Zhou Wen was slightly taken aback. He was rather surprised that Fang Ruoxi thought so highly of him. He couldn't help but feel some indescribable, odd feelings. What's in Jing if you say something like that? Zhou Wen said in a self-deprecating manner. Although he wasn't concerned about his defeat under In Jing's hands, he had to admit that she was much stronger than he was. Fang Ruoxi sighed. I said the only person in Guide High School. And Jing was never one of us. Also, she will not be participating in the college entrance exams here. What do you mean? Zhou Wen was taken aback. Don't you know? She has already transferred out. Fang Ruoxi paused and continued, although I don't know In Jing's origins, I'm certain that she has exceeded the mortal stage. To reach such a stage at her age, she must have quite a remarkable background. And with that strength of hers, it was completely unnecessary to challenge you. Furthermore, her arrival and departure happened so suddenly. It gives the feeling that she just came here to beat you up. I even imagined that you were acquainted with her and had crossed her somehow. Zhou Wen had never thought too much about it previously. Now, on careful thought, it did seem to be the case. He could, however, be sure that he had never met In Jing before, much less have crossed her. How is that possible? I've never met her before. How could I have crossed her? Zhou Wen tried carefully recalling but couldn't figure out how he could have had bad blood with her. Perhaps I was just overthinking it. Fang Ruoxi didn't continue on the topic as she looked at Zhou Wen and asked, so, what's your answer? Since you are willing to team up with me, I naturally don't mind cozying up to someone powerful, Zhou Wen said with a shrug. Then it's a deal. I've already found the other two teammates. Starting today, the four of us will train together during cultivation classes in the afternoon. We need to ensure that we have the necessary teamwork and coordination during the combat test. Fang Ruoxi looked at her wristwatch and turned to say to Zhou Wen, come on. Cultivation classes are about to begin. When Li Zi and Tian Xingdong watched Fang Ruoxi return with Zhou Wen, they were quite surprised. They knew that she had gone to find their fourth teammate, but weren't aware of who she had in mind. Now, upon realizing that it was Zhou Wen, they felt puzzled. They all knew of Zhou Wen's antics over the past month. Cultivation was in an ever-regressive state, especially combat. Even frequent practice made it difficult to seize fleeting opportunities in battle. The lack of practice for a few days greatly slowed down one's reflexes. Considering how Zhou Wen hadn't practiced for over a month with him completely engrossed in gaming to the point of looking pale and sickly, it was almost a certainty that his combat abilities had drastically fallen. It was just like a professional boxer. They needed enough time to recover and train after a period of zero practice to compete in matches again. No one could become stronger doing nothing. They only became weaker. They weren't that far off from the college entrance exams, and even if Zhou Wen made a comeback like a prodigal son, it would be very difficult for him to recover his original combat prowess. Ruoxi, don't tell me the fourth teammate is Zhou Wen. Is this a joke? Tian Xingdong rubbed his nose and said in an exaggerated manner. I'm not joking. Zhou Wen will be our fourth teammate, Fang Ruoxi said in all seriousness. Tian Xingdong looked at Fang Ruoxi and then at Zhou Wen. He habitually rubbed his nose and said, Ruoxi, all of us know how talented and capable Zhou Wen is, but he hasn't been training for more than a month. Even if he were to restart his training now, it will be difficult for him to recover his former standards. Our goal is to be first in Guide City's combat test. I don't think Zhou Wen is the best candidate. Why don't we do this? I have some ties with Zheng Yi. If you feel uncomfortable asking him, I'll do the invitation. How about that? Article 5 of 30. Tian Xingdong's words were clearly directed at Zhou Wen, but the latter wasn't angered. The combat test at the college entrance exam was key to the latter half of an average person's life. Anyone would hope to do their best and not have others affect their own results. Whether one could attend a reputable school, find a decent job after graduation, or even have the chance of entering high society was highly tied to the test. Furthermore, the strength of a teammate affected one's safety. No one wished to use their lives as a joke. Even Zhou Wen had aimed for a reputable school before he obtained the mysterious phone. This gave him more opportunities to become stronger and not let his talent go to waste. Therefore, Zhou Wen could fully comprehend Tian Xingdong's rationale for saying such things. After Tian Xingdong said his piece, he stopped looking at Fang Ruoxi and stared at Zhou Wen. Fang Ruoxi looked at Zhou Wen and said, Zheng Yi might be outstanding as well, but I think Zhou Wen is the best candidate. By the side, Li Zi thought and said, we know you have an eye for talent, Ruoxi. Zhou Wen is indeed outstanding, but the combat test results are very important to all of us. We have to treat it with utmost seriousness. Let's do this. If Zhou Wen doesn't mind, we can do a simple test. Once the results of the test are out, it will be obvious if Zhou Wen suits our team. Li Zi is right. I agree, Tian Xingdong said immediately. What kind of test? Fang Ruoxi asked. Wouldn't that be simple? I'm the weakest among the three of us. Let Zhou Wen fight me in combat. As long as he wins me, he will naturally be qualified to join our team. You wouldn't call that bullying, right? Tian Xingdong hurriedly said. Fang Ruoxi didn't say a word and looked at Zhou Wen. Zhou Wen knew that he needed to voice his opinion at such times, otherwise it would be difficult for him to join the team. Although he wasn't too interested in joining this team, he still wished to get good results for the combat test. Fang Ruoxi's team was likely considered the strongest team at Guide High School, so there was definitely no harm in joining them. I'm fine with that. However, actual combat has risks. It would be terrible if anyone gets injured, Zhou Wen said with a nod. Tian Xingdong laughed in response. Zhou Wen, I know you've been cultivating ascetic meditation. Your constitution and strength must be extraordinary, but your speed must be lacking. I won't take advantage of your weaknesses. Why don't we determine the winner through a strength competition? Fang Ruoxi couldn't help but frown when she heard Tian Xingdong. Tian Xingdong cultivated lightning art, and it was also a primordial energy art that primarily unleashed massive bursts of strength. Tian Xingdong had also coupled lightning art with a primordial energy skill, Lightning Fist. Tian Xingdong's Lightning Fist had only reached rank 1, however, among typical high school students, the chances of them coming into contact with a primordial energy skill was rather low. To grasp one primordial energy skill, especially one that matched their primordial energy art, was very rare. Fang Ruoxi didn't know Zhou Wen's family background, but from the way he cultivated a primordial energy art like ascetic meditation without ever purchasing any supplementary primordial energy crystals, it was highly likely that his family wasn't well-to-do. If he couldn't even afford primordial energy crystals, how could he have the money to buy the expensive primordial energy skill crystals? Furthermore, in his battle with Jing, he hadn't used any primordial energy skills. Fang Ruoxi's lips quivered, but she didn't say a word. She thought inwardly, let's see how Zhou Wen will handle this. Zhou Wen looked at Tian Xingdong and asked, how do we compete in strength? Although the school has a strength measuring device, those lifeless numbers don't mean much. Let's exchange blows. Whoever retreats loses. How about that? Tian Xingdong said with squinted eyes. I think it's better we use the school's strength measure device, Zhou Wen said after some thought. Why? Are you afraid of me injuring you? Tian Xingdong said, curling his lips. Zhou Wen smiled without a word. He was more afraid of killing Tian Xingdong with one punch. Tian Xingdong's primordial energy skill, Lightning Fist, wasn't a secret at school. Just relying on strength alone probably couldn't beat him. Therefore, if Zhou Wen used Vigor Divine Fist, he was afraid that a single punch would obliterate Tian Xingdong's arm as well as his body. Alright. Since you're afraid, let's use the strength measuring device, Tian Xingdong said, feeling some regret. For the past 3 years in high school, all the teachers and students had claimed that Zhou Wen was the #1 genius of Guide High School. Tian Xingdong naturally wasn't very accepting of this accolade and had long wished to prove himself by defeating Zhou Wen. This was a tiny wish many top students at the school had. After Zhou Wen was defeated by Jing's single blow, this desire subsided significantly. However, since there was a chance to defeat him, Tian Xingdong still held some anticipation and excitement. After all, Zhou Wen was once honored as Guide High School's #1 genius. The only thing that left Tian Xingdong regretful was that he couldn't personally defeat Zhou Wen as Jing did. All he could do was defeat him with numbers on a strength measuring device. Now that it was lunchtime, the device room didn't have any students. As always, Yu Qiubei was inspecting the various devices personally, checking to see if there were any problematic ones that could receive timely repairs. Just as Yu Qiubei sat inside a spacecraft-like primordial energy measurement device, he heard someone push open the door. Following that there were footsteps. It's lunchtime. Who would come here? Yu Qiubei looked out the observation hole from inside the device and discovered that it was Fang Ruoxi, Tian Xingdong, Li Zi and Zhou Wen. He couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. These 4 students could basically be considered the top elites of Guide High School's graduating class. Apart from Zhou Wen's wallowing in self-misery, the other 3 were highly anticipated to do well. For the 4 to come to the device room, including Zhou Wen, left Yu Qiubei curious. He had no idea what they were doing here. 4. Could these 4 be forming a team to participate in the combat test? But with Zhou Wen's current state, how could Fang Ruoxi and the rest be willing to form a team with him? Yu Qiubei's heart stirred as he remained inside the primordial energy measuring device. He was curious as to what they were up to. Who's going first? You or me? Tian Xingdong walked to the strength measuring device and turned to look at Zhou Wen. Anything works, Zhou Wen said indifferently. Anyway, everyone gets 3 tries. The highest one shall count. Since it doesn't matter who goes first, I'll do the honors first, Tian Xingdong said as he walked in front of the device. Tian Xingdong took a deep breath as he circulated his lightning art and gathered his strength before smashing his fist into the pressure board on the strength measuring device. The pressure board was made up of a metal alloy with hydraulic machinery behind. Based on the different amount of strength delivered, the board would jerk back and produce a figure on screen. When Tian Xingdong threw the punch, a series of numbers lit up on the display one after another. It only stopped when it reached 7. Tian Xingdong hadn't used Lightning Fist and had only relied on pure strength. With regard to that, he was rather satisfied with the value of 7. For the average high school student, a strength value of 7 was undoubtedly head and shoulders above their peers.